I talk about a variety of different role-playing game mechanics from a variety of different role-playing games and how you can use these mechanics in the game of your choice today on Daddy Rolled a One. Please help support Daddy Rolled a One by visiting my shop to buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, tote bag, or notebook. I have a bunch of new designs, including the new D10 and D12 patent designs to join the patent designs for the D4, D8, and D20 that I already had. So please head over to the shop. There's a link in the show notes below, and thank you so much for your support. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on tabletop role-playing game reviews, kind of, but it's also going to be related to a video that I just did last week, on the non-unified mechanics of early editions of Dungeons & Dragons. So I would recommend that you watch that video. You don't have to watch it first necessarily, but the short version of that video is that in the early editions of D&D, all the way up through second and edition and everything, up until third, had a bunch of different systems for different situations in the game. So it wasn't always just roll a d20 and roll high. Sometimes you wanted to roll low. Other times you were rolling a d6 or percentile dice, or sometimes 2d6. It kind of just depended on the situation, what the character was trying to accomplish or what the DM was trying to figure out. And as I was going through that and figuring out what I wanted to talk about in that video and all those different mechanics, I realized how much I actually did like the idea of non-unified mechanics. And it made me think of some of the mechanics that I like in some other role-playing games. And I thought it would be fun to talk about some of my favorites and how you might be able to apply them to your games. So if you like the idea of sort of those deep dives into questions like, why did early D&D have non-unified mechanics? Then I would encourage you to please subscribe to my channel and make sure that you hit the bell icon to be notified when I post new content, because a lot of the videos that I make here are about early tabletop role-playing games, and not just reviews of old games, but it's talking about concepts, why things were created the way that they were. A lot of times I think we sort of get away. So far, it's been 50 years since the original game came out. And I think a lot of times we don't necessarily question why things were the way they were. We just look back at things and go, oh, well, that's dumb. I know a lot of people think non-unified mechanics makes no sense. Why wouldn't you want to have a unified mechanic? Well, there were reasons why they did that, and I discussed some of them in that video. So definitely would appreciate a subscription, and if you could share the video with other friends that you think might like this type of content, I would appreciate it, as that's the fastest way to help my channel grow. Also, if you're considering subscribing, one of the things you can do to help support the channel is to become a super fan. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the names of my current super fans. But if you see that little heart logo next to the video with the $sign in it, that's a way that you can contribute to help show your support for my channel. And I really appreciate all the people who do that. All right, so I'm going to be talking about, I think it's 5 different kind of mechanics from 5 different games that I like, and then I'm going to sort of do a bonus or an honorable mention or something like that at the very, very end. But I'm going to kind of start with talking about things that are, D&D, and then sort of D&D adjacent. And then as we go on, each mechanic that I talk about is going to be from a system that's further and further away from Dungeons and Dragons, just to kind of show you how different games handle different things differently, but also how I've been inspired by some of these mechanics from games that didn't necessarily, weren't necessarily created for the system I was running, but sometimes can be slotted in pretty easily. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about, of course, is from my favorite. So this is 1981 Moldvay Basic Dungeons and Dragons. So, and this is the game that I'm currently running for my daughter and her friends. So I have that campaign or the playlist called it's called DM Advice, and I'm thinking of changing that. Somebody in the comments, and I forget who it was, but thank you for this comment, suggested that I might get more views in that if I called it something else, because it's not really just me giving advice on how to run the game. What it is me talking about the campaign that I run for my daughter that is using BX and is using also a lot of old school adventures, Keep on the Borderlands and Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, and talking about how I run them for her game and different ideas that I've incorporated into those. So it's not like a Matt Colville kind of thing, like how to run combat, or it's not like videos that talk about like how to create the best fighter. That's not what my DM advice videos are about. So if you haven't given those a chance before, you might want to just check out that playlist and see. I think you'll be surprised to find some interesting things in there. But in any event, I am running this version of the game for my daughter, again, and her friends, and they were like 10 or 11 when we started, and they're all 15 now, which is just crazy to me. But one of the things that I really like, and I like most of the stuff that's in here, but I'm just going to pick one, kind of. Maybe I'm going to cheat and do like a 1.5. But in the combat sequence, which is, as I'm going to be honest, as a kid, we completely ignored this. We kind of just didn't really read through this. And that's a problem, I think, with a lot of folks, especially back in the day. You kind of just wanted to start playing. And so I learned to play not by reading this, but by having other folks teach me to play. And when we were playing, they didn't use this combat sequence. But as I went back and looked at it from my daughter's game, and again, I'll be honest here, I don't necessarily do it rules as written. So one of the things that I understand is that Tom Moldvay, who is the person who edited this version of the book, which is why it's called Moldvay Basic, or other people call it BX. I also call it BX. But anyway, I understand that Tom Moldvay didn't even do combat this way. So he did side initiative, which is to roll a d6, and whoever gets the highest gets the initiative. If both sides tie, then the actions happen simultaneously, which means that if you kill somebody on your turn in initiative order, because actions are happening simultaneously, they still get a chance to hit you. So, but that's only if both sides roll the same number on initiative. But he didn't necessarily follow this order. And this order comes from war games. It's very closely tied to the order of combat that was in Chainmail, as far as, morale. So it's the 5 M's. It's morale, movement, missile, magic, and melee. And it kind of makes sense, but it technically, I think that this order of combat makes more sense if each side takes the phases in order. So one side moves, then the other side moves. Like whoever got the initiative, their side moves first, then the other side moves first. Then one side does missile fire, and then the other side does missile fire. I kind of think that it makes sense. I don't play it that way. I just do straight side initiative and ask my players, like, what do you want to do? And then we follow through in the sequence of like what they said that they were going to do. But I don't necessarily like have, I just start, I go clockwise, starting on my left, and that player goes first, and then everybody else goes first. So I don't really follow this order. Now, probably the breakdown of that is that technically spellcasters can be interrupted by missile fire, because you see magic comes after missile fire. And that's part of this idea, is that a spellcaster in the middle of casting a spell, before they cast it, they could be shot by an arrow, and that's going to disrupt their casting. But anyway, the part that I like, that I want to talk about, is morale checks, which is something that it's actually in 5e even. It's just buried, and it's like an optional rule. And I think most people just ignore it because it's, comes after hundreds of pages of reading other things. But the idea is that when you start a combat or an encounter, there might not necessarily be combat if the other side fails their morale roll. And so morale is based on rolling a 2d6, which I just talked about how much I love rolling 2d6 and the kind of spread that you get with a 2d6 table. But you roll 2d6 and you compare it to the monster morale score. So monster morale is listed in the stat blocks here. So you see that there. For giant centipede, the morale is 7. For doppelganger, the morale is 10. Okay, so obviously different monsters have different morale depending on like how tough they are, or how much they're going to be willing to fight. So, like you see here, the living statue, they all have a morale of 11. So the idea is you roll 2d6, and if you roll the morale or higher, then they're going to flee. And if you roll lower, that means they're going to stay and they're going to fight. Okay. So obviously having a morale of 11, it means it's going to be very, very difficult for a living statue to run away because they don't have emotions. They're not going to be scared. Okay. There's really no reason for them to run. So, but something like the giant centipede you saw at a 7, that's average. So that's in that kind of middle range from 6 to 8 that you would get on a 2d6 roll. So, there's a chance that the giant centipede, when combat starts, might flee before it even starts. Okay. Or it might not fight. Okay. So that's part of this order of combat. And I use all the time in my daughter's game. And it helps a lot. It helps from the game kind of getting slogged down and just where it's constant combat all the time. Because, my daughter actually, she's not a fan of combat. One of the players is. My daughter isn't necessarily. She prefers more of like role playing a little bit. And then there's one player who's super into role playing, but she also really likes combat. So all the 3 girls players that are left, there used to be 5, but there's only 3 now. But they all kind of approach combat differently in terms of how much they like or don't like it. But I like using this morale roll because it helps make every combat different. It also, because every monster has a different morale score, it helps the monsters to become differentiated besides just how you describe them. It's also based on like how much they want to stay and fight. And then, as the DM, it's up to you to narrate why they aren't fighting if they fail their morale roll. So something like a kobold with a morale roll here of 6, or it says 6 or C below. So, they're more likely to flee. And so that's a way that you can describe, like, they're kind of maybe more cowardly or, because they're smaller and, things like that. And I just like that idea. The other thing that happens in here is that when you roll for morale at the beginning, there's 2 other times where it suggests when to check morale. And that's when a side has a first death in combat, either monsters or characters, and when half the monsters have been incapacitated, such as killed, asleep due to magic, and so forth. So one of the other things that happens with morale is that your characters, hirelings, retainers, henchmen, all that stuff, they are going to roll morale as well. And their morale score is impacted by their loyalty and and by the character's charisma score. So you see here, it talks about retainers' morale. And so there's a chance that your NPCs that are on the player character side, they might get scared if one of the player characters dies, or if another, NPC dies, and they have to check the morale then, and then they might flee in the middle of the combat. So I have used that before and roll morale. And usually what it is one of my players, it's the dad player. He will often remind me like, hey, these guys just lost more than half their people. Like, do they need to check morale? So it says that, you can check twice. If they succeed on their morale check 2 times, then you don't have to keep checking. But I really like the idea of using morale. And this is something that you can use, again, in any game, especially like a D&D game. You'd have to assign a morale score, but you could use the old BX rules, or you could find Old School Essentials rules, which are they have an SRD online that you can access for free. Old School Essentials is essentially just this game. I've talked about that before, but kind of just formatted and laid out differently, but otherwise rules wise it's 100% identical. And anyway, use that as a guide, right? So in 5e, monsters tend to be a little bit tougher. So maybe you raise the morale score a little bit higher than what you see here, or maybe you leave it the same, doesn't matter. And just use that as a guideline and then have a morale score for your monsters. And I think starting a combat by rolling morale is a fun way to kind of like add a little bit of chaos and a little bit of unpredictability to what otherwise just becomes like, oh, I'm going to hit it with my sword like every single time. And, especially in 5e when your characters are, optimized, where you have these cool combat actions that you want to take. But then having that morale kind of like throws a wrench into that because you might not get to do it. And maybe the monster runs away before the fight even starts. And then you have to decide, like, is it worth it to try to chase them down just to get the experience points or whatever? So anyway, morale is one of my favorite things. And the other thing that I did want to mention, because I was talking about 2d6 rolls, and it's kind of related to It's related to combat and morale, but it's the monster reactions. And I've talked about this a lot on the channel before. It is just absolutely one of my favorite mechanics from this edition of D&D, which is, how the monsters are going to react when you encounter them and what might happen. And I think that that's just such a fun way of, rather than just deciding right away that there's going to be a combat that occurs. And in fact, they even talk in here in the example of play. Well, it says example of combat, but they come across some hobgoblins, and it talks about how the elf in the party is the only one that speaks hobgoblin. And so he steps forward because they don't want to fight these hobgoblins because there's too many of them. And he's just like, "Greetings, noble dwellers of deep caverns. Can we help you?" And then, the DM rolls on the reaction roll, but he rolls really, really low. So the goblins do end up attacking. But that's another mechanic that I think is really, really fun. And again, can be used in any version of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so that is one of the mechanics that I like from 1981 BX Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the next game that I want to talk about is going to be Black Hack. So Black Hack is a old school Renaissance OSR style, whatever you want to call it, type of game that is it's related to Dungeons and Dragons. It has a lot very similar, but it's very stripped down. It's very, very streamlined. And I actually don't own the main rule book for Black Hack, but I have this game that I helped kickstart years ago, Barbarians of the Ruined Earth. It's by Mike Evans. And I've mentioned before, I'm just a huge fan of the post-apocalyptic genre. And so Mike was like on his blog, had blogged a lot of these ideas before. And then when I saw that he was doing a Kickstarter, I was like, oh, I've got to get in on that. So there I am for one of the Kickstarter backers. And so when I got this, and I knew it was based on Black Hack, and I didn't know that much about it. And but Black Hack fortunately has an SRD online. And one of the things that I really like from this idea here of from the Black Hack kind of system is this one here. So it says usage die. And then you see here that anything that's consumable has a usage die. So arrows, bolts, darts, guns, ammo, flasks of oil, preserved rations, fresh rations, torches, water skins. Okay, so what is this usage die? Well, basically the idea is that a lot of people don't like keeping track of things like how many arrows do I have left, like counting arrows, or again, counting things like rations or torches, like, how many torches have I gone through, this kind of thing. And, I actually don't mind it. We keep track in my daughter's game, or at least we started to at the beginning. But I am trying this usage die out in that game because it actually works in pretty much, again, any kind of D&D related system. So I'd hesitate to maybe use it in something that's not kind of, like I said, D&D adjacent, because, a lot of times other systems, like they're built on an entirely different premise, and their probabilities and things like that maybe just wouldn't work with something like this. But for any kind of, class and level system that has, the 6 ability scores and that kind of standard thing, roll D20 to hit, that kind of stuff, I think that this would work fine. So the idea is that anytime you use one of these consumable resources, like a torch or eat a ration or fire an arrow or a bolt or whatever it is, use oil, you roll that usage die that was associated with that item that we kind of saw that a second ago. You roll that die in the next turn, or it says the next minute, but a turn is a minute. And so the next minute you roll that. And if you roll a 1 or a 2 on that die, you downgrade that die to the next lower die type. So if a consumable, like the arrows that we saw, like their usage die is a D10. Okay, so if you fire some arrows, then you roll a D10, and if you get a 1 or a 2, you're going to downgrade that to a D8. And then the next time you fire arrows, if you haven't purchased any more in the intervening time period, the next time you fire, then a minute later, you're going to roll that die, and if you roll a 1 or 2, you're going to downgrade it to a D6. Now, once you get down to a D4, if you roll a 1 or a 2 on a D4, then you've expended all of your usages of that item, and then you have to resupply. So you'll see that something like holy water starts out at a D4. So there's a chance that the very first time you use it, it might be the only time that you get to use it during that adventure. So, and then, I think there's neat little things in here like preserved rations versus fresh rations. So fresh rations are a lot cheaper. They're like a third as cheap as the preserved rations. However, their usage die is much, much lower. So there's a chance that the first time you use your fresh rations, you might be gone, right? They might be done. So I think it's a really unique and clever mechanic for keeping track of things that people, often complain about not wanting to keep track of. So it kind of depends. You guys have heard me talk before in my daughter's game. One of the things I think that people tend to kind of, again, they overlook for the sake of like having a more fun experience. And if that makes your experience more fun, definitely do that. But I think there's a thought that sometimes people get tied up with the idea that having these systems where you're tracking things is boring and it doesn't add to the gameplay. It's part of the gameplay. You have to remember that these games came out of war games that had all these different subsystems, and that keeping track of things and making sure that you're resupplying and spending your money to get the supplies that you need and buying the right supplies for the job that you have, that is part of the game. That's part of being clever as a player and knowing that you might need these things, or talking around town like, has anyone been in this dungeon before? Have they come back out? What did they have to say about it? Like, what did they say was down there? Like, doing your research and talking to people to figure out like what you might need before you go, and then supplying yourself appropriately, and then keeping track of, well, I bought a quiver of arrows, but is that going to be enough? Like, maybe I need 2 like whatever it is, right? So, and then weighing that against how heavy is this thing to carry. So all those things all work together. And when you start to kind of pull the threads and go like, okay, I'm going to remove this piece, well, then the system kind of starts to break down. So something like this usage die, definitely works in a game like Black Hack, because that is intended to be more streamlined and not necessarily trying to replicate all those different interconnecting subsystems that are based on, having to do all that work to figure out exactly what you need. And it's sort of like that's when a lot of times people talk about like player versus DM. It wasn't necessarily like that the DM's out to kill your characters, which is what a lot of players or your gamers now will look back at like player versus DM and kind of think that like that was the intent. It's not that. It's really that the DM is trying to be just as clever as the players. The DM is trying to create situations that are unexpected, and then the players are, by their standpoint, are being clever to try to figure out how to solve those situations. So, and the DM wants them to succeed, but the fun comes from having something that you totally couldn't predict and didn't intend to have happen, and then the players figuring out how to circumnavigate that based on the things that they had done, like how many supplies they brought with them, things like that, right? So and Black Hack, I think kind of gets a little bit away from that in order to just like get rushing right into play, which is totally fine. And that's where the usage die comes in handy. But I do think it could work in games where people don't want all those subsystems. So you could even use the usage die. You could use it in 5e. I think you could use it in 3e. You could obviously use it in BX, and I have run it. I have started to use it in my daughter's game because we got away from tracking that kind of stuff. So, every once in a while I would say like, how many arrows do you have left? And the player would kind of look at me like during the headlights, like she'd been caught. And it's like, if that's not fun for them, then I'm trying to figure out a way that like it still is going to have consequences. It's still going to matter. And the usage die seems to be doing that. So we only just started doing it. So I'd been aware of it for a while. I just hadn't thought of using it in this game until I started realizing that like they weren't necessarily keeping track. I would always say things like, oh, you just use food. And in the early days, they would get super like, they would get stressed as they were crossing food off. They'd see the numbers going down and they'd start sharing food between each other and things like that. And that was really fun. But, now I think it's just something that it's like, they're just, they forget. And I also forget to remind them. So having the usage die, I think, is going to be kind of helpful for that. And again, help to retain some of that stress level that I want. It's like, oh, then it's getting low, it's going down. Like, how are you going to adjust for this? And then, to keep that alive without like the obsessive book tracking. So anyway, check out the usage die and, let me know what you think about that one. I think it's kind of a fun way to handle, an old school mechanic, but in like a new way. Okay, so the third one I wanted to talk about, and this is still kind of related to D&D, although it's getting a little farther from the kind of the older school D&D that I'm preferring to run these days. And so this is 13th Age. So this is a game that was created sort of post 3rd and 4th edition, and it's created by, two of the main designers, Jonathan Tweet and Rob Heinzu. They were responsible for working on 3rd, 3.5, and 4th. And so it's kind of bridging the gap a little bit. It's definitely more 3rd-ish than 4th. I think a lot of the things that people don't like in 4th aren't really in here. But I have heard this game described as being like how to fix what was wrong with 4E and make it more like Dungeons & Dragons kind of. Maybe. There's some really cool stuff in here. And, I bought this game mainly to steal ideas from it for my other games, right? But it's a fun read. It's an interesting concept. So there's a few things in here that I could have picked as far as like the kind of the mechanic from here that I kind of like the best. One of the things is called icons, and I actually adapted this idea to a 3rd edition game, my long-running 3rd edition campaign that I'm running. I didn't use any of the ones from this book, so that's part of the downside of this book is that this system is really heavily tied to the campaign setting that they created, this empire here, and so a lot of the rules and the concepts are related to playing in that world. And if you're not playing in that, you kind of have to do a lot more work as a DM. So they have this concept called icons, and your characters get points that they can put into relationships with these different icons. These are like ultra high level, powerful NPCs. You could almost think of them like patrons for Warlock, except they're not that. But you get points that you can put into your relationships, and that relationship can be conflicted, or it can be a positive relationship, or it could be a negative relationship. And then there's sort of like good, neutral, and evil, for lack of better terminology, icons. And then you the usage, or not the usage die, that was a different thing. The icons that when you have those points that you put in there. You're rolling at the beginning of each session, and depending on the rolls that come up, your relationship with that icon, whether it's positive, neutral, or positive, conflicted, or negative, it might impact the story, or what happens during that session on top of whatever the DM had planned, right? So it's kind of hard to explain unless you really get into it. But what I did was take these icons and I replaced them with factions in my game. So I didn't use NPCs, but I used like factions. And then I had my players pick which factions they had. And I don't really roll the dice. I don't use the point thing, but really it's the idea of like making sure that my players were being grounded in my campaign setting by having them establish a positive, a conflicted, and a negative relationship with 3 different factions. And then that would be able to come up like during play. So that was a cool idea. There's another one in here that I almost picked, and it's not even really like a mechanic. It's a little bit more story based, and so you can kind of see how this is sort of getting closer to like a more modern style of game. But the idea, it's called the One Unique Thing, and the idea of the One Unique Thing is that every player gets to pick a thing that like they're the only person in the world who does that thing. And it's not really going to give you a mechanical bonus. It's mostly for role-playing purposes. So, like, one of the things, like, the ideas would be, like, I'm a deathless pirate whose soul is trapped in a gem controlled by the Blue Dragon. Or I am one of a couple dozen surviving members of the Order of the Koru, a group of rangers who move through the Empire on or beside the Koru behemoths. I'm the bastard son of the Emperor. I'm the oldest elf in the world. So that one I like. Like, I'm the oldest elf in the world. I think that could bring a lot of fun role-playing opportunities. I hear pain is music. I'm a former cultist. I'm the 3-time winner of the Dwarven Drinking Championship. They're just like goofy, fun little things, but that are unique to your character. But I didn't pick that. So what did I pick? Well, I picked this idea in here called the Escalation Die. So this is a really kind of fun thing, but it's not really going to work too much in an old school game. You could use it, but things could get a little swingy in combat very, very quickly. But the idea is that when combat starts, your escalation die is at 0. And then on the second round of combat, you put a D6 on the table and you set it at 1. And during that round, all of the PCs gain +1 on their attack rolls. And then each round after that, you increase the die by 1. So on the third round, it goes to 2. On the fourth round, it goes to 3, etc. Okay, so, and they're getting that bonus. So the idea is that it's going to help combats against really powerful foes to be over quicker, because combat in 3.5 and in 4E, one of the complaints that people have about that, and it's in 5e as well, is that combat just takes too long. I remember when we played 3.5, there were some sessions where the entire session was just combat, and that's all we accomplished during that entire session. And while it's fun to do combat, a 4-hour-long combat is, to me, not fun. It's quite boring, especially when it's not your turn, and because turns take so long, or rounds take so long between each player, like figuring out all the different options and things that they have to do. And then you've got monsters with these super high ACs, so only like really high level die rolls are going to hit them. So that's what the escalation die is designed to kind of help mitigate, is that as the combat drags on, it's actually going to get easier to hit the bad guys. Which might sound counterintuitive, because you might be thinking like, well, it should get harder because I'm getting tired. But like, don't think of it that way. Again, these are all abstract. It's not intended to, emulate reality. It's a game. And so the idea is, again, that it's getting easier to hit the monsters, which will help the combat be over quicker. But one of the unique things that's this, and this is why I think it wouldn't necessarily work in like an old school game. It is something that could be adapted to 5e, but it would take a little bit of work. But the idea is that your characters have certain abilities that are, level based. Like fighters get to pick different powers at different levels, that kind of thing, just like in 5e. Or like feats, it could be that kind of thing, where those things, they can't use them until the die is on a certain number. So sometimes it'll be like, oh, this ability will activate on an odd number. This ability will activate on an even number, that kind of thing. Other times it's just like, oh, the escalation die has to be at a certain number, or sometimes it's at a certain number or higher in order to be able to use that thing. And then characters also have, much like 4E, they have abilities that sometimes can only be used like once per encounter or once per day. And that relies on the escalation die being at a certain number, but you also sometimes want to save those abilities to where, like if you have an ability that you can only use once per encounter, but you miss when you're attacking, that ability is wasted. But if you wait until the end where you've got a +6 to hit from the escalation die, then that's the time to like activate that, right? Because their chances of getting a successful hit are +30%, right? It's 30% higher. So I thought that was really kind of unique in a way to kind of make this so it was more than just it's a bonus to hit. It's having these abilities be activated depending on where the escalation die has landed during that combat. So that's the kind of part that I think could be adapted to 5e, because 5e players, characters have level-based abilities, and you could, if you wanted to, as a DM, you could kind of lock some of them down and say, oh, you could only use this if the escalation die is like odd, or if it's 3 or higher or 4 or higher, whatever it is. Again, it would take a lot of work to kind of do that, but it would be a way to try to incorporate this into like, a 5e game. Again, with like something like BX that I run for my daughter, I don't really use this because they don't have any level-based abilities. They don't really have anything that I could lock down and say, oh, it's only going to be activated once the escalation die hits a certain level. And they don't really need that, +6 bonus on the 7th round of combat to hit something. So it's not something I necessarily need to give them, because the combat system in BX is not weighted to, like, this would make it way too swingy, is what I'm trying to say. Now, a couple of things that work with the escalation die as well is monsters don't use it, except some very certain high level powerful monsters. So like dragons get to use the escalation die, but typically it's reserved only for the PCs. And then also the DM or referee or GM or whatever you want to call it controls whether the escalation die actually goes up. So if during the combat, if the referee feels that the characters aren't really using it to their advantage, because the idea is that it's supposed to make you a little bit more I guess brave or reckless or whatever you want to say, foolhardy during combat, because the longer the combat goes, the bigger your bonus is to hit. But if you're not taking advantage of that, if you're hanging back, you're waiting for, you're hiding or something, whatever it is, right? You're not engaging to the level that the referee thinks that you should be. It's within the referee's purview to then dial the escalation die down, or to completely reset it at 0, which would be, that would suck if you were waiting to do something and then it gets reset to 0. So the idea is that this is intended to push you to take action so that combat doesn't take as long. You're not constantly like reevaluating your tactical situation to where your turn takes 15 minutes to figure out and explain what it is that your character's doing, which is, again, one of the things that people complained about a lot in sort of those later era D&D editions. So I really like the escalation die from this, but I like it specifically because of the way that it ties into the mechanics of this game, and it created something that's unique to the system that, again, the system is based on, like I said, it's really more 3.5, but there are some elements of 4E in here, like those kind of like encounter and daily powers, like that kind of thing. But I liked the idea that it created a brand new mechanic that took advantage of the other mechanics that were already in the system and made something kind of new and different. And so anyway, let me know what you think about this. If you've heard of 13th Age, again, I kind of bought it mainly to mine it for ideas, as I mentioned before. But I know one of my friends, so it's my friend Kelvin Green, who did a lot of the art for this book. A lot of these illustrations are by him. And he's also a D&D content creator, an OSR content creator. He does a lot of, like he did Big Terror in the Streets that I've reviewed here before. And he loves this game. He's always, like, on social media, he's always talking about, like, whenever it comes up, he'll mention how much he really likes this particular game. So, I would love to hear from folks that have actually played it. So I've not played a 13th Age game. I've just taken bits and pieces of it to use in my 3.5 game. All right. So, but yeah, let me know what you think about it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, so the fourth one I wanted to talk about, this is starting to get really far from Dungeons and Dragons in terms of mechanics, but this is from Call of Cthulhu, which is a skill-based game with, using percentages. And, this is the, I think, 7th edition, if I remember correctly. And interestingly enough, so I have played Call of Cthulhu, like, as far as a genre. However, the actual game mechanics, my recollection is that I only played the original game, like, I think once when I was, a kid. And then later on, I met some friends and they wanted to run a game in Cthulhu and decided to use, at the time, the D20 Call of Cthulhu rules system, because we were all used to playing 3rd edition 3.5. And so we bought those books and played. And then the guy that was running the game realized pretty quickly that those rules weren't really working in order to emulate the Cthulhu genre. And it's not, so they were written by, I just forgot I was going to say Monty Cook, but no, I'm not sure that it was him. I'll look that up and put it up here on the screen. And I still have my book, but it's one that I rarely look back at. And I think it's a good example of the idea that, like, there's a lot of people that, I noticed it especially becoming very prevalent during 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, when the D20 system was kind of ubiquitous for a while. And people trying to recreate every genre of game that you could think of using the D20 system, because it was like instant sales, because people would go out and buy, and I was one of the people that would go out and buy pretty much anything that, had any kind of decent level of graphic design to it that worked with D20, because the idea was like I would be able to grab things from there, whether it was new feats or skills or whatever it was, and use those in my game. And so I think a lot of people kind of just decided to do that. But then I think over time, people sort of began to realize, and it's very similar to the idea of like having non-unified mechanics versus unified mechanics. It's kind of that same mindset, which is like there's a certain type of person that will say like, well, I only play 5e. And so I don't need another game system. If you want me to play in another genre, run that genre in 5e. And I get it. And I think a lot of it comes down to the investment in both time and money that you put into a system, and you want to amortize that investment over time. And so the idea of like every time changing a campaign that you're changing a system as well, that's more money that you have to put into it, and then more time to try to learn a new thing. So I understand the hesitance of people that do not want to learn a new system, but there are some cases where I think, and the D20 Call of Cthulhu, I think, is a perfect example, at least for my group that we played. We were so used to playing D&D in that system that we continued to play in that same manner. And Call of Cthulhu is not intended to be played that way. It's not a combat-oriented game. But we were used to it being that. And so we crafted our characters to be more competent than I think a typical investigator would be in a regular Call of Cthulhu game. And we engaged in combat much more often than we normally would have. And I think in a regular Call of Cthulhu game, and the guy who was running the game, he noticed it right away. And after just a few sessions even, we decided to bag that and then look for a new system. He eventually settled on running Realms of Cthulhu using Savage Worlds. And that's what we used to like finish out what was it? The Massive Nyarlathotep, I think, was the main Cthulhu campaign that everybody talks about. Like we played that. We took like, I don't know, 13 years or something. I mean, we had a few hiatus periods in between, but we took a really long time to finish that, but we finished like the entire thing, and it was so much fun. But using the Savage Worlds rules really kind of helped it be closer to the genre. He did not want to use the original rules. So that's just talking about this. And so, but one of the things that I remember, and the mechanic that I wanted to talk about, is this one here, which is called pushing the roll. And this is an idea, not necessarily the way that you'd handle it mechanically, but an idea that I think could be applied to a lot of different games. And the idea is that pushing a skill roll, it's usually reserved for skills, gives your player a second chance to attempt to achieve if they failed the first time. And so, but it's not an automatic thing. So it involves role playing and story-based stuff for the player to explain how and why they deserve to get that pushed roll, and attempting to, narrate what would happen. And the idea is that the stakes go up so much higher in the second roll. So you failed the first time, which means that your failure, if you fail on your second roll, your pushed roll, is going to be catastrophic to your character and or to the campaign. And so, so they call them keepers. That's the referee, right? Or the game master. So the keeper doesn't just say yes or no. They have to decide if the player has made a case to make that push roll. And then they have to figure out like, what are those consequences? So this isn't I wouldn't say a unique thing. A lot of people call it, I think would say fail forward. And it's not that you get a second roll, but it's that if there's a thing that the DM, like if it's going to completely derail everything, like if the DM has hidden something behind a secret door and you fail to find the secret door, then that whole thing is going to fall apart, right? Well, that's also poor. I'd say kind of poor DMing or poor adventure design if everything is reliant on a single die roll and it falls apart if you don't make it. I think that's a whole other thing to discuss, but the fail forward idea would say, okay, well, you quote unquote failed to find the the secret door, but you actually found it, but there's a consequence. So that's fail forward, which is similar to this, but this is a little bit different because if you make it the second time, then the bad thing isn't going to happen. And so the examples they give is like you're trying to break down a door. The pushed roll might mean that you throw yourself into it with no heed for your own safety, or you're trying to persuade a police officer, which might mean risking arrest if if your roll is failed the second roll. Or it talks about like if you're searching a room, it might mean turning it over and risking breaking things or spending too long there when you know the bad guys might return at any moment. Or you're trying to, pick a lock, and then it might mean something breaks because you used too much force. But what broke? Was it the lock or was it your lock picks? So these are all really fun, descriptive ideas that could be used with skill rolls, like I said, in another game. So this is something where I don't really think it would break. The system, like an escalation die might break, or like the usage die could break things depending on how interconnected all your subsystems are that you're using. But this idea of pushing a roll that you failed, I don't think it's going to really break anything. And I actually really like the idea of the player needing to come up with a convincing case of why they get to try again, but also what might happen if they fail. And then the referee making a determination. It's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But you could use all these examples here of the consequence from the pushed roll failing and use that in any game you're playing that uses that kind of fail forward idea, if you need to. So I really like this idea down here, this description, in this kind of parchment text or whatever you want to call it. So it talks about how this character named Harvey is fleeing from cultists, and the player's trying to hide behind a market stall. But then, and then the referee decides that you need to make a stealth roll. And the player fails the roll. And so then the referee says, oh, well, it turns out there's just a couple of boxes on the pavement, like nothing, that you can really hide behind. And so then the player decides that he wants to push the roll and try hiding again. But it's not like he just tries hiding behind those same boxes again. That's not what this is about. So the player completely turns it around and goes, well, the marketplace is pretty crowded. I'm going to try to just blend into the crowd and try to just get by and hope that like there's so many people here that I'm kind of almost like hiding in plain sight and maybe they won't see me. And then the idea of the consequence is that he's actually now much easier to spot because he's not crouching down behind any boxes, but there's a chance that he might be able to blend in. And so then he describes it in such a way that the referee was like, yeah, go ahead and try that. And, but knowing that if you fail, they're definitely going to spot you and they're going to catch you or like whatever. And so, but the player makes the second stealth roll. And so the cultists completely lose where he is in the crowd. And I thought like, that's, it's just such a fun idea. And it's, and again, something that you could use in pretty much any role-playing game. They limit it to skills. So in this case, it says here, like, only skills and characteristic rolls can be pushed. So you can't use it for luck tests or sanity checks or combat rolls or damage rolls or any of that kind of stuff. So, and I think that's fair. But again, I would love to hear from folks who like this type of mechanic. Maybe you use fail forward and you got some ideas here from how you might be able to narrate those consequences or come up with ideas of consequences for fail forward rolls, but also just the idea of pushing rolls. Do you think that pushing a roll could work in a 5e game or a 3e game of Dungeons and Dragons where you have skills and you fail your skill roll the first time? Would you allow your player to try to come up with a different scenario where they might want to retake that? So there's just all kinds of examples in here of, how you could do a pushed roll. So within the skills section. So like on a stealth roll, for example, it says a pushing example might be taking more time to study the area, removing your shoes, causing a distraction, sitting tight until the coast appears clear. So the idea with push rolls is that they don't happen automatically after the last one failed, right? So it could be minutes later, it could be hours. In some cases, it might even be days, right? So the depending on what it is that you're doing. So the push roll, again, it doesn't happen automatically. It's something that you have to describe, and you have to go out of your way to create a situation where you know what the consequences, or that you know the consequences are going to be bad. So they talk about with stealth example consequences of failing a push roll. Unbeknownst to you, you've been spotted, and rather than approach you directly, the cultists decide to summon something in quotes to get you, and or you hear a covered door behind you, which you're hiding behind, being locked and then nailed shut. Or and then all of these have something that happens if your investigator has lost their sanity, right? So in this case, it would be if they fail a push roll, the investigator may believe that he or she is invisible when in fact everyone can see them, which is really fun, right? And then so I know my players in my daughter's game, like they would love to role play something like that, where they think that they're invisible, but everyone else can see them. They really like acting out stuff like that, role-playing stuff like that. But this is just full of examples of different things. And I think that this can give you ideas on how to narrate the consequences of skill rolls, again, in like a D&D game, even like 3.5 or 4E or 5E. So operating heavy machinery. So to push an example, you could say like, oh, I have to go step by step with the operating manual, which is going to take time to practice, or maybe seek out a teacher. So that's something that could delay you again by a matter of days. If you really need to operate this machine, seeking out somebody to teach you how to use it, that's a pushed example. But then consequences of failing that, so maybe you're driving a bulldozer, but you get overconfident and you lose control, so it veers into a brick wall and the wall comes down on you, or something worse happens. And then again, if you have if your mind's been broken by the things that you weren't supposed to see and be exposed to in a Cthulhu game, you might believe that you're tasked with unearthing or building a temple to the great old ones, right? So which is again really fun. Or like listening. This is a skill that people use in D&D all the time, right? So a push example would be stopping dead still, and then listening, getting closer to the presumed source, like putting your ear to a train track or to the door, telling everyone around you to be quiet, and then by consequence, you're making noise by telling them that. And then consequences of failing, the thing has caught you unaware, you're surprised, you misheard the conversation, get the facts mixed up, you're caught trying to eavesdrop and find yourself in a very embarrassing situation. Or again, if you've lost you've lost your mental capacity, then maybe you become overly sensitive to all the sounds and unable to operate without earplugs or something similar. Lock picking, needing to completely dismantle the lock, taking longer, using force to pry the mechanism, and then as a consequence, the lock is damaged beyond repair, and perhaps your lock pick has snapped off inside the lock. You break the puzzle box, or perhaps only smashing it will open it now. You trip an alarm, you make enough noise for someone or something to come along looking, and then if you have lost your sanity at this point, maybe you give up on the lock in question and realize the higher purpose of unlocking their own mind, a veil that has been lifted from their eyes, and they see the world in a new way that makes complete sense to them, but no sense to anyone else of sound mind. So again, really fun ideas that draw upon again, the concept of your mind breaking because of the things that you've been exposed to, those are really fun consequences. But even the regular consequences, I think, are ideas that you could lift up and use in a lot of different styles of games. So let me know what you think about this, and whether you think it was something that could be used in a D&D style game, and or if you've tried that, or if you what you think of my idea of using these descriptions to help narrate a fail forward result in those styles of games that do something like that. All right, now the fourth mechanic, is it fourth or fifth? One that I want to talk about is from Savage Worlds. So this is probably getting even farther away from D&D in terms of mechanics. But again, this is something that you could use in a lot of different styles of games. But so I have done a whole review of Savage Worlds before, but one of the things that you need to know about how this game works is that characters have, their different attributes. They've got 5 different ones, and then they have skills that are associated with those attributes. And rather than putting points into them, like in D&D, where, like in a 3rd edition game where you'd say, oh, I've put, 5 skill points into, stealth. And so then I make my D20 roll and I have my +5 plus my dexterity bonus, blah, blah, blah. In 5th edition, you're adding your proficiency bonus and your ability score bonus to your roll and, that kind of thing. In Savage Worlds, each of those skills and attributes is represented by a die type. So I showed this before, but this is my fun little case that my friend made for me. And so these are one of my sets of Savage Worlds dice. And so, your strength might be a D8. Okay. And then, or like maybe you have a this is 10. So maybe you have a D10 in, I don't know, like one of your skills, right? Whatever it is, you have a D10 in that, right? So, or maybe you have a D4, you could have that as well. Okay. So one of the things that's really cool though, is that, players are called wild cards. And so when you roll your die for that particular attribute or skill, usually, unless it's an opposed roll, the idea is that if you roll 4 or higher, you're going to succeed. Okay. So now obviously that means you're rolling a D4, your chance to succeed is only 25%. But if you're rolling a D6, your chances just jump to 50% because you get a 4, 5, or 6 out of a 6-sided die. That's 3 of the options, right? So the higher your die roll, or the higher your die type, obviously the greater your chance of success. And so as you level up, that's one of the things you're doing, is like looking where you want to, increase your die type. Okay. But player characters are called aces, or I'm sorry, they're called wild cards. And they also get to roll a second die, a wild card die. So even as a player, or as a wild card, there are some NPCs, like high level ones, that are also wild cards. Not high level, just important NPCs. You get to roll an extra D6. That's why this one is colored differently. And so the idea then is that I'm making a test, and I have, I need to beat a 4. I have a 25% chance to get it on this die, but I have a 50% chance to get it on this die. So I'm going to roll. Just came off the thing. So I got a 4 on this one. And then this one I got a 1. So that would have failed, but this one would have succeeded. So it doesn't matter which one succeeds as long as one of them does. Now, what's interesting, though, is that in this game, they have a rule or a mechanic called, it's called acing, or aces. Okay. And the idea is that all trait and then your damage rolls as well. It didn't used to be damage in earlier editions of Savage Worlds, I don't believe, but they changed it to include that in this newer. This is which one is this? Adventure Edition. Anyway, so all trait and damage rolls in Savage Worlds are open-ended, which means that when you roll the highest number possible on a die, so 6 on a D6 and 8 on a D8, etc., you get to roll that die again and add it to the total. That's called an ace. And that any modifiers to the die roll should then be tacked on after adding. So that is such a fun idea. I love it. I love the idea that, and it changes the mathematics, right? But the idea that you can, we call it exploding dice. That's what we call it when I play it. But like if I roll a 4 on this D4, which is a 25% chance of that happening, then I get to roll it again and add whatever I rolled. So say I rolled a 4 the first time and then I rolled again, I got a 4 again. So I get to keep going because I rolled a 4 again. And then I rolled it that time and I got a 2. So that would have been a total of 10. And that would have meant that I got a success and a raise. So raise is anything that's 4 over the original number. I'm not explaining it the exact right way because, again, sometimes there's opposed rolls. Okay. But in that particular case, let's assume that 4 was the number that I needed to hit and I got a 10, I got a success and a raise. And then that means something extra is going to happen, extra goodies. Now, if I was rolling damage and I rolled that and I would have done 10 points of damage, not 4 points, even though I was only starting with a D4, which is really fun. It makes the game much more, adds a little bit of chaos, adds a little bit of, like I said, unpredictability to the chaos or to the combat. And one of the ways that I heard it best described, and I think this is kind of a unique way, is think of Bard, the guard or whatever you want to call him in The Hobbit, right? So he gets the note from the little hummingbird to talk to him, and he shoots that one arrow and it pierces exactly where it needs to pierce, and he brings Smaug down with one hit of an arrow. Now, granted, it was the exact right spot he needs to hit, but the idea is that you could replicate something like that in Savage Worlds by getting multiple successes with your, with raises with your, missile fire hit. and then you're rolling damage, and that one arrow, if you just kept rolling the highest die type every time and it exploded, all of a sudden that arrow can do way more than just like a single wound. It could do like enough wounds to bring down a dragon if you roll well enough and you're just lucky enough to have that die type explode. And I've seen it before. So one of my favorite times, and I think I told this story before, but I will tell it now because we're talking about this. So I had a character we were playing. It was a Call of Cthulhu game, and I think this was during Masks of Nyarlathotep. I was just talking about that. So my character, or maybe it was Deadline. It doesn't matter. No, it was Call of Cthulhu, and my character was known for I was not great at hand-to-hand fighting, and I wasn't great at shooting. I had a little bit of shooting, but I was really good at good in quotes. I was known as being the dynamite guy. So I was carrying sticks of dynamite, and we got into a situation where we were in a bar, like a tavern or somewhere, and I forget where we're in Morocco, maybe. I think we were. I forget exactly where we were, but we found ourselves like, 1930s, 1920s, whatever it was. And we were in this bar, and there was going to be a fight. We could tell all of a sudden like this fight was going to break out. And I wasn't great at shooting. And also, I don't know if we were even carrying guns with us. We probably were, but like we didn't want to make too much of a scene, although that's going to be too late based on what my character did. But the bad guys were behind the bar, and we were out in the middle of the floor. And so we flipped the table over so that we could get some protection. And I ducked down behind the table, and I grabbed a stick of dynamite, and my throwing skill was a D4. And so I rolled a D4, and then I rolled my ace die. So I rolled them, and let's just say, well, this is what happened the second time. I got a 1 and a 1. So I guess a little spoiler alert, but I missed. So I didn't roll a 1 and a 2, but I definitely didn't hit. And so then, I rolled lower than I needed to. And so the DM said, okay, we'll roll to see which direction, like first, how far did it go? And so we figured that out. And then he said, okay, and then roll to see which direction it goes, not where you intended for it to land. And the way that we rolled the die, the DM like looked at the map and he calculated, and he said, okay, well, it's supposed to come back, but it can't based on where it had, was supposed to land. And so he basically said, I threw it and it bounced off against the back wall of the bar and it fell into the bar. It's not what I intended, but that's what happened. And it blew up and it killed one of the guys, even though I had kind of failed my throwing roll. And so I was like, okay. So then on the next round, I was like, I'm going to do it again, but this time I'm going to throw 2. Like if one dynamite stick's better, I'm going to throw 2. And so I rolled my 4 and my 6, and I got double 1s, which meant that, obviously it's a catastrophic fail. So if you roll double 1s, you cannot spend a Benny to reroll. That's one thing that you can do in Savage Worlds. One of the things that you can do is spend these little Benny tokens to reroll a failed roll. But if you roll double 1s, you cannot. And so I was like, okay, I'm in trouble. And so it was up to the DM to decide, or the GM to decide what happened. And he decided that roll was so bad. He's like, after you lit them, before you threw them, like you slipped or something and you dropped them at your feet. So like they're going to explode right where you're standing. So I was going to take this damage. So then I had to roll damage. And so I had 2... I had 2 sticks of dynamite, and I want to say the damage was 2d6 for each. And so I rolled the damage, and what happened was both of them had one of my 6-sided die exploded, and I rolled again, and it exploded again, and then I rolled again. So I rolled at least 3, if not 4 times, due to like these constant explosions of damage, which was just ridiculous. We were just cracking up. We were laughing so hard, and my character took like 3 wounds or so. And like basically, I was able to spend bennies to kind of soak some of the damage. But I was out of commission for pretty much the rest of that fight. And it was just the funniest thing to roll double 1s, the worst roll that you could get, followed by successive over and over, like, they call it acing, we call it exploding dice. And it was just such a fun experience. It's one of my most memorable role-playing game experiences in the last maybe 20 years. Other than like, some of the fun sessions I've had with my daughter, as far as like me playing, that's probably the one thing that I remember the most, was just that ridiculously streak of bad luck that I had. But I took that idea of exploding dice. So this is my book that I, tried to kickstart, and I didn't try. I did kickstart this back in June. And I'm just trying to show you guys the progress. I know people keep asking. So for folks that contributed to the Kickstarter and wondering where the POD is. So this is now the second POD that I've ordered. It came up, it's kind of hard to see, but it showed up all bent in the mail, which was not the fault of the company. That was like my post person, my mail person. It was in a cardboard thing. That shouldn't have happened. The first one showed up just fine. It just it printed wrong. So this one, I finally got the layout correct as far as like my page spreads. However, the printing is all off. So as an example, there's not supposed to be a white background behind this picture. And then obviously you see this is all screwed up. So, I'm continuing to try to figure out like what the deal is. The first one printed fine. It was just my page layouts were off. This one, the page layouts are correct, but the printing was off. And I thought it was a fault with their printer, but they're saying it was a fault with my file, which makes no sense because it's the same file we sent them before and it printed fine. And then their reply was, well, sometimes it might work, but you really should have sent us a different file. So anyone who's ever worked with DriveThruRPG, I mean, I like them for what they are, but it is very frustrating for a first timer like me to figure this out. And my print production person, and that's his career. He does this as a job, as graphic design. He's never had any kind of problems like this in his entire, 30-year career of working in this field. So, in any event, I'm close. I'm sorry for the wait, guys. If you contributed to this, it is coming. I've finally figured out the layout issue. So we just need to redo the files. And one of the things that's happening with that is that I forgot that I needed to leave a blank page for them to put this little print thing on the back, which meant that they were adding in all these extra pages because mine was exactly 44 pages. And they said, oh, no, it has to be, if you wanted it to be 44 pages, you had to make it 43 so that you could leave a blank page. So we're trying to figure out how to take this open game license and stick it like on here and change the layout of that page. So it should be coming quickly. And thank you so much for your patience. But really, what I wanted to talk about in here, the reason I brought this up is because for my demolitionist character class in here, one of the things that I had for demolitions is this idea that when rolling for damage, if a 6 is rolled on a die 6, you get to roll another d6 and add the results together. So that's only for demolitions that are created by the demolitionist. But I think it's a fun way, again, to kind of add a little bit of like unpredictability to explosions, like because sometimes they're bigger than you had intended. So I got that idea again from this. I think other people might have done it in the past for other things, but I mainly got it from Savage Worlds. So that's that idea. Let me know what you think about exploding dice. And if you like that idea, if you play Savage Worlds or if you play other games, I'm sure there are other games that use that. It can't only be this, but I think it's a really fun concept, and it's really come up some fun times in our games. Of course, everyone has like their lucky D6 or whatever that they use that they think is, rolls more 6s or whatever. But again, it adds just a little bit of an unpredictable element to the game, which I really like. Okay, and then last up, I'm going to have kind of like 2 honorable mentions. And I'll explain why I'm calling them honorable mentions. But the first one, and I think this is going to get a lot of dislike from some folks who just really can't stand 5e for whatever reason. But I quite like it. And it's a mechanic that I actually use in my daughter's game in lieu of the standard way of doing it. And I didn't look up what page it was on because it's... there it is, I think. Anyway, it is advantage and disadvantage. And I think it's such a great, elegant, simple mechanic that can be used, again, in pretty much any game that involves rolling dice. So the idea is that, I'm sure everybody knows this, but just in case, if you're someone who's completely avoided 5e or, maybe you just don't play any kind of Dungeons and Dragons game, maybe you haven't heard of this. But the idea is that, if you have advantage on a roll, you roll twice and then you take the higher number. And then if you have disadvantage, you roll twice and you take the lower number. And so it creates a swing that, mathematically, I think is close to like around 4 point something. It's close to a 0.5. Some people say 3 point something. But, 3.5 had all these different conditions, like, if you have cover, then it's this. But then if you, you are elevated, then you have, this bonus, but then the cover, someone's behind cover. So then you take them out. So you had to keep track of like all these different things and figure out, like, I've got 8 plus 2s, and then I've got, 7 minus 2s, and then this other thing, and to figure out like what your final bonus and or penalty was. And this just removes all of that because you don't do all that. The DM decides like you have advantage because you have elevation, or you have disadvantage because the person's behind cover. You don't get both. You get one or the other. And the referee, the DM, makes that determination and tells you whether you have it or not. So sometimes it'll tell you if you get advantage, like if there's certain things that you're doing. But I use this in my daughter's game because BX is full of usually it tells you, you can do +2 or do -2. Yeah, I could do that. I like to do advantage and disadvantage because my players like to roll dice, and they also like that moment of like, if they have disadvantage, rolling a 20 when you have disadvantage is so disheartening because you feel like you've just wasted it because you have to take the lower number. And then similarly, rolling a 1 if you have advantage is great because you've gotten rid of the 1. That's an automatic failure, and you use the higher die, right? So they like rolling the extra dice, and so it just adds a little kind of fun element to the game. And so a lot of times I will use that advantage disadvantage instead of like a standard +2 or -2 bonus to certain things. And again, I think it's very simple. They weren't necessarily the first game to do this. It's the first Dungeons and Dragons game that put this as a core mechanic. There was a monster in first edition, I think, that had an advantage. They didn't call it advantage, disadvantage, and I forget the name of the monster. It was something like a twin kind of thing, but the idea was that they got to roll 2 dice and pick the higher one on their turn during their actions. And so, the idea has been around for a while. I'm pretty sure there are other systems that do it, but it really got codified in Dungeons and Dragons in 5th edition, and I think it was a great addition to the game. And it helped kind of get away from having to keep track of all those different conditions that might affect different rolls. So I think it's a fun idea, and but I put it as an honorable mention because, again, I know most of my viewers tend to be more like old school players, and a lot of them just really don't like 5e. A lot of them won't even listen to anything that Wizards of the Coast has done, I guess, but I still think that's a fun idea. All right. And then the other one I wanted to put, I added 2 honorable mentions, is from this book. Now, this is actually kind of like a adventure/campaign setting. It is technically created for 5e. However, there's very little 5e in here other than like monster stats. It's pretty well known in the old school community that this is one of the most old school books ever written for 5e. And again, I've talked about it before, but one of the things that I loved, and I've definitely used this in my daughter's game, is the chase sequences. And the idea is that you play rock, paper, scissors when you're doing a chase, rather than just rolling dice and seeing like, who gets initiative goes first, and then whoever has the fastest movement is going to win. That's so boring. And like, chases should be fun. And so the idea is that you play rock, paper, scissors. And scissors is like attack, or I forget which is which. But anyway, so rock is attack, paper is evade, and scissors is sprint. And so it's the same thing as like, rock beats scissors, scissors cuts paper, paper beats rock. So, but instead it's attack, sprint, or evade, and you're doing it that way. And then different things happen based on like, if you're attacking, you can only make certain kinds of attacks because you're in the middle of a chase. And winning or losing the attack doesn't necessarily mean that you get farther because, if you were trying to evade, but the other person was attacking, they still get their attack. It doesn't mean that, they don't get their attack, but it also means that like they didn't catch up to you because you were evading them. So you won on that particular thing. And then the idea is that you have to decide ahead of time, like, you might need 5 wins before 5 losses, but a high challenge might mean that you need 6 wins before 2 losses. And then the DM sets those grounds. So I used this in one of the very first games. It was, I think, the second session. It might have even been the first. I think it was the second session I ran for my daughter's game. And I stood up because I stand up when I DM. And so I was moving around the table and I did round robin who was going to make the turns. They were trying to escape from some goblin caves and they were being chased and they were trying to get out and they couldn't see. It was dark. They had no idea where they were going. And so that added an element to that. And so they went through and I was like, okay, we're going to do rock, paper, scissors. And so I would go up to each player when it was their turn to pick. And I'd say like, just didn't even let them think. I'd go rock, paper, scissors, go. And they were freaking out. They were like, what's happening? And then, so they did it. And then once they started to figure out that was going to impact how quickly they could get out of these caves based on like which rock, paper, scissors they were throwing and what that meant. And, it was so much fun. They're like the anxiety and the stress level in a good way, which is what I wanted. I want them to be invested in this game and not just sit there and roll some dice to see who moved farther. Like it was interactive and we were playing it and I loved it. I love it so much. And, I feel like it's, this book is so cheap. It's like like $25 or something for what this is. Gorgeously illustrated book with maps and all kinds of goodies in here. But just for this alone, it was almost worth the $25. So, I can't recommend this guy's books enough. He's done another one for Oz. That's more of a city-based campaign. This is more like wilderness, highlands, obviously. But just the cleverness of applying that kind of mechanic that has nothing to do with standard D&D dice and probabilities. And, your ability scores don't affect this. Your proficiency bonuses, your level, none of that matters. It's rock, paper, scissors. And I know that might sound arbitrary, but believe me, it was such a blast. So I would highly recommend, I recommend getting this book anyway, because it's just fun of good ideas, but applying different types of mechanics for chase sequences to your games, I think is a really fun idea. So I've, taking that idea, I've then used that to do other things on my game, like drawing cards and things like that aren't, again, standard D&D mechanics, but allow me to get up close to my players, interact with them. They're drawing a card from a deck that I'm handing to them. And it just is so much better than me sitting behind a screen, telling them to roll another die or something. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but just, breaking things up a little bit and realizing that like not everything has to come down to rolling a single D20 to figure out if you succeeded or failed. So that's going to be my last one for this particular video, and that's going to wrap this up. So what I would love to hear from you guys is your favorite mechanics from other games, even if it's from another edition of D&D or something, but like something that you really like that you think was really well done. And particularly if you are taking ideas from one game and then using it in another, and why did you do that and how did it work, or did it break things and do you regret that you did it? So I'm wondering about the usage die that I'm using in my daughter's game and how much that's going to change it. I don't think it's going to change it too much, but like I mentioned, I just kind of started doing that, and so I'm a little I don't want to say I'm hesitant. I'm just kind of I'm keeping an eye on it because I want to make sure that like it doesn't change things too much. I might be overthinking it. That's very possible, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Now, I know there's a ton of systems out there that I didn't mention. So, before you say like, I'm surprised you didn't mention this, it's probably just because I didn't think of it. These are the first ones that just came off the top of my head. Also, like I kind of picked the systems that I'm played much more often. I've mostly played D&D systems and like adjacent. So like, I played a lot of Gamma World back in the day. And I've played, and I was also trying to like a little bit not spend too much time talking about concepts that I've covered before. So like Fame and Fortune from Top Secret, I think is a really fun mechanic, but I already kind of talked about that before in my video where I covered Top Secret. So those kinds of things. So, there's other games out there that I do like and I think have really fun mechanics. I just don't necessarily think of picking a system from that game and then using it in another one. So something like Marvel Superheroes that I talked about before. I really like the mechanics in there and how they, qualify how much more powerful different heroes are compared to each other. But that's not something I think of necessarily as using in another style of game. I think it's very self-contained within that system. But again, I would love to hear your thoughts on that and get your ideas. And if I get enough of ideas from folks, I might do a follow-up video with your comments and your mechanics that you like, as long as I have access to the game. I would be happy to cover that if it's something that sounds intriguing to me. So definitely leave those in the comments below. And then, of course, while you're below, you'll find places to join me on social media, and you'll find links to my blog. And that is going to be it for this particular video. So I really hope that you enjoyed it. I had fun kind of thinking over the last few days, like which mechanics I wanted to cover, which game systems I wanted to include. And, maybe some of these you haven't heard of before. And I hope that you got some inspiration from it to check out some new things. And let me know in the comments if that was something that happened. So that's going to be it. And until next time, happy gaming and stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So a little bit different today, but I'm going to again start with the drink. But I was having some Scotch whiskey. This is an Islay Scotch. So traditionally known to be a little more smoky, like Lefroy, which I've talked about on here before, is a traditional like Islay Scotch. This one's a little less smoky, but this is a BUNNAHABHAIN STIUIREADAIR. And I had never had this before, so I just picked this up at the store. I saw it, and when I was out shopping, and I thought, let's try this and see what it's like. And I quite like it. It's very pleasant. It's kind of nice because it's not super expensive for being a Scotch. So this one does not have an age statement on it, so we don't quite know how long it was aged. It's natural color, and it's a little higher in ABV. I think this one is 46.3%. Yeah. So traditional, the minimum for whiskey is usually 40. So this was slightly higher. But anyway, just poured myself a little wee dram here. So on the nose, it's very like fruity, maybe plum, vanilla, of course, from the barrel aging, but some spice. It's a little hard to identify what spice is, but anyway, gonna give it a little sip here. It's kind of almost viscous, or like a creamy kind of mouthfeel. Again, you get that vanilla kind of like toffee-ish. So that reminds me almost a little bit more of like a bourbon. Not getting a lot of smoke off of this, really. Despite the fact that, again, Islay Scotches tend to be associated with being heavily smoked. I'm not really getting that here. Maybe like some raisins. And then there's like a little like salinity, kind of like that sea salt, which is, again, something that people would associate with an Islay Scotch, like on the back. It's very nice. This is one that, normally I like to put a little, use an eyedropper, put a few drops of water in when I'm drinking Scotch. But in this case, this is very drinkable without adding the water. There's I'm not getting like that harsh alcoholic burn as I sip on it. So it's a pleasant, like, little sipper. Anyway, BUNNAHABHAIN. And so I was going to feature a different album today. So today is September 9th, 2024. So it is the anniversary of the birth of Otis Redding. But I sadly only own one Otis Redding record, and I've already featured it here on the channel. But today is also the anniversary of jazz drummer Elvin Jones, and I have a bunch of stuff that he's played on. Probably the one people maybe best know, I guess, would be the A Love Supreme by John Coltrane and his quartet. So Elvin Jones was part of the quartet with McCoy Tyner and obviously John Coltrane. I decided to change it up at the last minute. So I'm gonna save the record that I was gonna feature because I've already talked about Love Supreme. But I found out earlier today, as I was recording, that James Earl Jones passed away earlier today. Like I found that I'm kind of in between my different recordings. And so I didn't actually listen to this record while I was planning my notes. I just brought it out as a tribute. So I've shown my old original Star Wars, 2LP soundtrack from the 1970s. I've featured that on the channel before, but I thought I would bring this one out because it actually has the voice of James Earl Jones on here. So this is The Adventures of Luke Skywalker, The Empire Strikes Back. So this is it's essentially like a story record. This is a sticker I put on this way back in the 70s. I want to say I got this after I went to the dentist, maybe. But it's been on here for over 40 years and there's no way it's coming off now. And I feel bad that I put it on here, but I have a very distinct memory of sticking it on here. But you can see here, it says featuring the voices of, and here is James Earl Jones as Darth Vader. So his career spanned way more than Star Wars. He had so many great roles. But I just wanted to pull this one out because I first heard of him when I saw Star Wars in the theater and I saw that he did the voice for Darth Vader. So I've put my record, I've not put it in the sleeve anymore because I was trying to get a little bit of ring wear on the sleeve. And it was a really tight fit. And so I didn't want to force it. But anyway, basically what this is, there's music, but there's narration. I forget who the narrator is. I don't even know if it says on here. No, I guess not. But there's somebody narrating the action. But then otherwise, it's featuring clips of dialogue from the actual movie, condensed down into like 45 minutes. And so there's all these different little scenes and stuff. And so you can definitely pick out James Earl Jones because it's the actual dialogue, again, from the movie and him doing Darth Vader. So I wanted to honor him by putting this record on. So, and also just kind of sharing it with you guys. So this isn't something you're going to find on like a Spotify or something like that. I did find somebody has made a recording of this and posted it on YouTube. It's really crackly. It's in super bad shape, unfortunately. So it's kind of difficult to listen to. And, this is very much a product of its time, like a story record where you're hearing a distilled, condensed version of the movie without the visuals, obviously, on a record in 44 minutes. I'm not even sure that they would make something like this anymore because, people just have instantaneous access to, the actual movie itself. So why would you want to listen to a record version that's, cuts a bunch of stuff out when you could just watch the whole movie? So, but I remember as a kid, this is the 1980 when this came out. This is sort of like, we didn't have a VCR back then, or VHS, whatever. We had nothing like that. The movies weren't shown on TV, so it came out in the theater, and then when it was gone, you weren't seeing it again. So every once in a while they would do a special re-release, and I don't remember if they did that for Empire. I know for Star Wars, came out in May of 1977, and then it had a re-release in the theaters that December at Christmas time because they knew kids would be out of school and they could go see it again. And that's the first time I ever saw a movie twice in the theater. I remember my dad took me back to see it at Christmas time and how excited I was. We did see Empire, I want to say more than once, when it came out in May of 1980. I like that movie. Really, I was right at that peak age. Like I was 6.5 or so when Star Wars came out, but I was 9.5 when Empire came out, and I loved like the darker themes and the music. I mean, of course, that Imperial theme, and the figures were so cool. I remember getting some of the figures, like the Snow Trooper. I think I had that figure before I'd even seen the movie in the theater, and I just thought it was so cool that they had different kinds of stormtroopers. That hadn't occurred to me that you could have those. And so I played the heck out of this, as evidenced by me putting the sticker on here. It's it's a fun thing to have from my collection, and I dig it out. Usually I dig it out on Star Wars Day on May the 4th every year. But I brought it out today to honor actor James Earl Jones, who again passed away earlier today. I think he was 93. So Sláinte, which is like Scottish for cheers, essentially, to James Earl Jones. Traveling mercies to him. And thank you so much for sticking through the bonus content, supporting my channel, and watching my videos. I really appreciate it. Cheers.